Welcome to the Silent Empires. Tonight, step into the world of Richard V. Gotti, the quiet yet loyal figure who stood in the long shadow of one of America's most powerful mafia dynasties. A man of few words but deep loyalty, Richard's story is one of family ties, silent power, and the heavy price of the Gotti legacy. As you close your eyes, picture the dim lights of New York's underworld, the whispers of loyalty traded in the dark, and the silent weight of carrying a family name written in history. Before we begin, share your city and the time you're listening in the comments. I always enjoy seeing where these stories reach. And if you enjoy sleeping stories of gangsters and forgotten empires, don't forget to subscribe and join our family. And also, like this video, your support truly motivates us to keep bringing you these timeless tales. Now, settle in and let the echoes of loyalty and legacy guide you through the night. Richard V. Gotti was born in 1,942 inches, New York City, New York, right in the heart of the place that would later shape his life. Growing up in a tight-knit Italian-American family, he was surrounded by the traditions, struggles, and street codes of the city's neighborhoods. As the younger brother of the infamous John Gotti, Richard found himself drawn into the same world of organized crime that made his family name both feared and respected across New York. Some households find a way into city politics, some drift toward the unions, others into small trades. The Gotti clan found itself near the orbit of a neighborhood crew that was, over time, tied to the Gambino family. It didn't happen in a single day. It grew in bits. Favors that needed doing, debts that needed collecting, introductions that needed smoothing. Older brothers learned who mattered on a given block and how a stubborn problem could be solved without a scene. Those lessons passed down at kitchen tables and sidewalks at dusk. Richard listened, took note, learned the value of keeping things calm. By the late 1960 seconds and 1970 seconds, New York's rackets shifted with the city itself. Construction boomed, shipping yards changed, bars needed entertainment and protection and cash. Heavy businesses drew men who could offer safety or pressure, depending on the hour. The Gambino family under Carlo Gambino prized order and profits. Crews didn't roar, they collected. If you were reliable, you got more to handle. If you were sloppy, you were moved aside. Richard was not loud. He learned to reconcile a week's take, to know which bettor needed a warning, and which pizzeria owner needed a break to keep paying. People who knew the scene later described him as steady and deliberate, someone who understood that quiet kept the money flowing. As his brother John rose through the Bergen crew in Ozone Park and built a name that the city would soon know far too well, Richard kept to his lane. The Bergen Hunt and Fish Club, and later the Ravenite Social Club in Little Italy, drew more attention than someone who preferred diners, back booths, and lingering over a cup of coffee he didn't touch. Law enforcement came to believe, through surveillance and informant debriefings, that by the 1980 seconds Richard had been formally inducted and held responsibilities consistent with a soldier in the Gambino ranks, later trusted with broader oversight. The exact date of any ceremony remains the kind of detail insiders guard, but prosecutors and agents described him in filings as a man with a say in Queen's affairs, the kind that touched gambling, loans, and business insurance that wasn't sold by licensed brokers. The work, as presented in court papers, looked like this. Bookmakers taking action on sports and horses, with runners bringing the numbers in. Video poker, and other machines tucked in the corners of bars. Shylock loans extended at high weekly interest to cash-strapped shop owners. Collection routes where a fee bought peace from vandalism or disruption, and day-to-day arbitration of disputes among people who didn't call the police. Cash moved in envelopes. Notes were kept in coded address books. Shells and third parties made money hard to trace. Proceeds, agents said, went up the ladder, some to the crew, some to the man in charge, some as tribute to higher offices. It was a system that could run for years if no one got greedy and no one drew a spotlight. Greed and spotlight, of course, arrived. In 1985, Paul Castellano was shot dead outside Sparks Steakhouse, and John took the top seat in a blaze of media. The cameras loved him. The city watched. With that attention came routine waves of surveillance, recording devices, and grand juries. The government didn't stop pressing after one headline. It kept building charts. In those years, brothers and cousins took on larger roles. Gene handled a crew until his own narcotics case in 1989 took him off the street. Peter and others moved into more senior roles. Richard, identified by investigators as Richard V. Gotti, the V for Vincent, continued to manage rackets in Queens, according to reports. He wasn't the one at the table telling jokes for the press. He was the one ensuring that the numbers balanced on Monday morning. The 1,992 conviction of John changed everything again. Without the front man, the machine needed caretakers. Interim leadership shifted. John's son, John Jr., would be described as acting boss for a time. Peter later emerged as a power. In this period, the government tightened pressure on the family's revenue streams. The Windows case had already clipped influence in city construction. Other probes targeted waste-hauling routes, trucking, and union locals. Crews that once collected without interruption found checks delayed, envelopes lighter, and more people wired for sound. If you were running a Shylock book or a string of machines, you learned to watch for a new bartender who asked too many questions and to move meetings to a different table at the diner. Richard's name appears in this era's files as a man in charge of a crew, a capo who kept an eye on operations in Queens. He wasn't constantly in the press, but his presence surfaced in sealed affidavits, wiretap summaries, and proffer sessions that emerged years later in court. Agents mapped his routine, the stops he made, the faces he saw, the patience with which he listened before instructing someone to sit with a debtor, to renegotiate a number, to adjust a skim to keep a bar owner paying. Every time the government shut down a line of gambling machines, another set found its way into new corners under different names. Every time a debtor claimed he was broke, an investigator said, the collections man found a friend to co-sign or a schedule that kept the money coming. Money laundering rarely looks dramatic. It looks like an invoice for services never provided. A small company formed in a relative's name. A check that doesn't match a delivered good. Prosecutors later said that Richard had a hand in this too, helping transform cash earnings into funds that could be held in bank accounts and moved between businesses without drawing immediate suspicion. Layer upon layer turned envelopes into numbers on paper. A restaurant here, a small construction outfit there, maybe a vending supply company folded between them. The sums weren't always massive at a single glance, but they added up, and the government's charts, when finally unsealed, tried to follow each turn. As the millennium approached, the old neighborhood clubs thinned, but the structure remained. Telephones replaced stoops. Pagers and throwaway lines replaced notes passed at lunch counters. People met in cars as often as at tables. A capo's job in that climate wasn't to pose. It was to anticipate a raid, read a room, and keep the flow smooth. Richard had by then a reputation inside those circles for caution. He knew which names to avoid on a call, and which topics belonged only in a walk around the block. He also knew family mattered. Nephews and sons grew up in the same neighborhoods and learned similar habits. That web blood in business made the family resilient and, at times, reckless. The early 2000s brought one of the most aggressive waves of arrests the New York families had seen in a long time. Federal indictments stacked counts of racketeering conspiracy, extortion, loan sharking, illegal gambling, and money laundering. They relied on wiretaps, cooperating witnesses, financial audits, and surveillance. In one of those sweeps, Richard V. Gotti was named alongside others, including his son, Richard G. Gotti. The filings described extortion of local businesses in Queens and Long Island, control over gambling machines, and efforts to collect on high-interest loans. They said that money was moved through shell companies, and that meetings took place in restaurants and homes where defendants thought they were safe. The arrests didn't come as a shock inside the life. They were the price of doing business after years of scrutiny. But the scale of the cases signaled something else. The government had spent years building these files, and it intended to keep stacking them. In court, prosecutors used acronyms and charts. Defense lawyers stressed doubt and challenged cooperators. Jury selection turned into a lesson about what New York had learned from decades of headlines. People remembered earlier trials, famous names, dramatic verdicts. Here, the story wasn't a single violent episode. It was a system, a loop of money and pressure played out over a city's map. The government argued that Richard was not a bystander but a supervisor, a man with authority to approve collections, to settle disputes, to direct others in a criminal enterprise that yielded steady income through illegal gambling, extortion, and loans at usurious rates. When agents played tapes where coded phrases referred to numbers and pickups, they offered witnesses to decode them. When they showed bank records that didn't match reported income, they called accountants to walk jurors through round numbers that never should have been round. Through it all, the picture that emerged was consistent with how people in that life often describe it privately. There is the face of the family, and there are its hands. Richard belonged to the second group. Prosecutors said hands that moved cash, hands that pointed under a table rather than over it, hands that waved someone in or out of a back booth. That role, less flashy than a boss's throne, kept businesses paying, kept numbers moving, kept crews connected to a central body. The danger in that role was not fame, but habits. The same route to the same lunch spot, the same code phrase, the same assumption that silence equals safety. Investigators learned those rhythms and, over time, used them. Beyond the courtrooms, ordinary life continued. Family dinners, children's birthdays, weddings, visits to relatives in the neighborhood those days coexisted with the other schedule. People who knew the family described a tight-knit unit that showed up for one another, that took pride in being from where they were from, that saw the world as a set of obligations. It's a contradiction New York understands. The man who holds a baby at a baptism may be the same man who, the next morning, quietly tells a bar owner his payment is late. The story of Richard Vincent Gotti lives at that intersection, in the routine of a man who rarely stepped on stage, yet figured in the ledgers and wiretaps that the government laid out when it finally pulled him into the spotlight. When arrests came, they came fast, early in the day, with agents knocking, reading rights, boxing papers, and tagging items that might later become exhibits. News vans rolled, anchors read names, and viewers who knew only one Gotti suddenly heard another. The public might have asked, who is he? To agents and lawyers who had spent years reading transcripts in a windowless room, the answer was not complicated. He was the quiet one who kept a segment of the enterprise earning. He was the man you meet if your payment is late, or your cut is light. He was, in their telling, a necessary piece in a system built to squeeze steady profits from a city that never stops moving. What that meant, in simple terms, was a life built on pressure and routine rather than noise and fame. It meant conversations held in low voices, money turned over on a schedule, and a belief that careful people could stay 2 steps ahead. It meant knowing the names of bartenders and bakers, the days the garbage trucks rolled down certain blocks, the weeks when bettors lost more than they won. It meant adjusting interest, so a debtor paid forever without collapsing, and it meant staying calm whenever the door opened and a stranger walked in. And ultimately, it meant that when the government's patience ran out, the record it presented, dates, times, amounts, voices, told a story of continuity, of a man whose strength was steadiness and whose undoing was the same. That is the life that trailed Richard Vincent Gotti across decades. The rise of a brother, the churn of a city, the steady hum of rackets that felt almost mundane to insiders, gambling, loans, collections, and the laundering that made the money usable. Those were his lanes, according to the cases filed against him. It is not a legend with a punchline, it is a ledger. There are no car chases here, no movie speeches. There is only the quiet discipline of an economy that shouldn't exist, and the slow, steady work by investigators who followed it until a courtroom could see it too. The years after his brother's trial changed the city's rhythm for everyone who had grown up around those clubs and corner diners. Fewer handshakes were casual, fewer phone calls lasted beyond a minute, and any meeting in a public place looked like 2 old friends chatting about weather. Richard adjusted without drama. He knew that the cameras kept rolling even when headlines cooled, and he treated every errand like an appointment that might end up on a chart in a windowless room. If a tavern owner wanted a break, he listened, weighed what could be eased without breaking the line, and left with a schedule both sides could live with. That approach kept tempers low and payments steady, the twin aims of anyone tasked with keeping a crew productive. A week in that world resembled bookkeeping more than theater. Mondays were for reconciling wagers from weekend games and horses, making sure runners were paid, and bettors who owed had a plan. Midweek belonged to machines tucked in the corners of bars and social clubs, boxes that lit up and rang for quarters and small bills and, when no one watched too closely, for more than simple entertainment. There were people who supplied them, collectors who lifted the trays, and drivers who hauled cash without leaving a paper trail. Richard's role, as agents later told jurors, was to set the lanes and keep everyone in the right one. If a bartender complained that a machine took too much space, a replacement appeared shaped a little slimmer. If a collector grumbled about fuel costs, The route got reorganized to trim miles and noise. He parceled tasks in a way that gave each man a piece he could manage without fuss. Writers who chase dramatic scenes often miss the small moves. A collection visit that ends with a revised payment rate instead of a scene is not flashy, but it prevents calls to the police and keeps a business open long enough to keep paying. A bookmaking line adjusted to hedge risk across weekends isn't a headline, but it protects the take when an underdog wins and bettors feel lucky again. That sort of foresight kept him valued, according to later testimony. People inside the life said he had patience for detail and a kind of discipline that rewarded steady hands. He wasn't famous, and that was the point. Agents watching the street learned those same patterns from a different angle. They followed sedans that made the same stops on Tuesdays and Thursdays. They saw familiar pairs lean against the same lamppost and pause at the same deli counter before walking a block apart. They watched for nods that replaced sentences and for an envelope slipped into a folded newspaper. Their work wasn't glamorous either. It meant long hours in cars, cameras tucked behind vents, scribbled notes about license plates and schedules that would make sense only months later when matched with toll records and phone logs. The phones mattered more with each year. Early on, payphones and beepers made it easier to stay unpinned. Later, prepaid cells did that job. A simple rule set the tone: never say the number, never say the name, never fix the meeting in the first call. Conversations were short, sometimes only a phrase. "I'll see you after lunch." "We're even on that. Bring the list." Prosecutors later brought in translators who knew that a list wasn't groceries, and that after lunch meant a specific hour on a specific block. They paired audio with surveillance photos and wrote affidavits that gave those words a frame. Bit by bit, a picture formed of who approved which collections, who could change a rate, and who had to ask first. Money rarely walked straight from a bar counter into a pocket. It took a tour. A shell company with a simple name and a rented mailbox sent an invoice for services that never happened. A vendor cut a check in return, then passed it along to a sister company that reported small profits and paid routine taxes just enough to look ordinary. Cash went to a check casher one week and a relative's business the next, then back into the street as loans at tough weekly rates. The whole exercise turned soft bills hard to trace. Richard, in the government's telling, had a hand in steering that flow so the same dollars didn't circle too close to any one name. When pressure rose in one corner, adjustments followed. After a wave of raids took machines from a chain of bars in Queens, different models appeared under different labels, placed through third parties 2 neighborhoods over. When a gambler who owed too much started missing meetings, the schedule softened just enough to keep him on the hook. A man paid forever if the number stayed barely within reach. That balance push hard enough to be taken seriously, pull back enough to avoid collapse took experience. It also took focus. People who worked with him said he didn't waste time on chatter. He broke problems into doable pieces and assigned them with a few words. Inside the family, titles mattered because they told everyone who could decide what. A soldier earned by proving reliability and discretion. A capo shaped a whole crew's priorities and answered for results. The difference showed in the types of calls a person took and the kinds of meetings he attended. Richard rose into that supervisory lane as years passed. He didn't claim turf in front of crowds or play loud in the press. He built trust by answering the same way twice. When a bookmaker argued he was being pushed too hard, Richard weighed the book's numbers and adjusted the weekly expectation by a small, specific amount. When a bar owner warned about a noisy new patron who asked questions about machines, the machine moved or the patron stopped showing up. Calm adjustments made ripples disappear. Family obligations overlapped with business in ways that outsiders misread as sentiment. A nephew looking to prove himself might be given a small route, or a few bettors to manage, not as a gift but as a test inside a safe lane. A cousin with a truck could be asked to make routine pickups, because the job paid and the accountability kept him close. Richard's circle included blood and old friends from neighborhoods that shared the same churches and ball fields. That web gave him help when needed, and eyes on blocks that otherwise would have taken longer to map. By the late 1,990 seconds, the government's patience turned to persistence. Major cases had drained influence from window contracts and certain union strongholds. The answer from inside the life was to lean harder into cash businesses that looked like background noise. Bars, diners, small construction outfits, local markets. Extortion in that environment didn't always sound like a threat. It sounded like a fee tucked into the cost of doing business. A soda supplier made his deliveries on time. Garbage pickup stayed smooth. No one broke a front window after midnight. In affidavit language, it read as protection. In day-to-day practice, it felt like a bill paid to avoid trouble that might otherwise show up often enough to ruin a week. Investigators used tax returns as often as they used tapes. When a person spent like he earned more than he claimed, alarms rang. Agents matched cars, vacations, and home improvements to declared income, and then looked for the gap. They checked bank deposits for round numbers that suggested collections rather than paychecks. They watched the way cash-heavy businesses reported receipts and compared those against inventory orders. If a pizza shop bought flour and cheese for 1,000 pies a week but claimed half that in sales, something was off. That kind of math caught more people than bragging did. Names that had stayed off front pages began appearing more often in indictments around the turn of the century. One sweeps list included Richard alongside men from different neighborhoods who touched the same streams of money. The charging papers described a structure with him near the top of a local ladder, supervising illegal gambling, approving loans, and authorizing collections on overdue accounts tied to businesses in Queens and out onto Long Island. Where older cases leaned heavily on undercover agents, these relied on wiretaps, cooperators, business records, and what prosecutors called pattern evidence, small episodes that, taken together, told a steady story. Arrest days followed a familiar script. Agents knocked early, read the warrant clearly, moved quick, and took papers, ledgers, pagers, and old flip phones that would later be translated into exhibits. Neighbors peeked out through blinds. Names were recited on late-night newscasts, and the usual experts explained the difference between a soldier and a capo, and how a racketeering conspiracy charge bundled gambling, loans, and extortion into a single narrative. For the people arrested, the gear shifted from routines at diners to routines in court, bail hearings, discovery fights, status conferences, and an endless parade of paperwork where each page meant another hour with counsel at a table. Trials in that era didn't center on a single dramatic act. They presented dozens of small ones, organized into a chart. A collector admitted he dropped off envelopes twice a week to a man who reported to Richard. A bar owner testified he paid a service fee on a schedule that never changed. A gambler described how his weekly debt adjustment came only after a phone call to someone he never met but whose decision, he was told, would stand. Auditors walked jurors through bank records and expenses. Surveillance agents pointed to photographs and paired them with a date and a tape where an innocuous phrase had a specific meaning once decoded. Defense teams pushed back hard. They questioned the motives of cooperators who had deals with the government, challenged the context of vague phrases on wiretaps, and emphasized that ordinary meetings at diners could mean anything in a city where half of its people do business over coffee. They argued that prosecutors were piling up innocent acts and calling the stack a crime. Jurors listened, weighed the steady accumulation of details, and asked questions through notes when a timeline needed tightening. The room stayed calm. No shouting matches, no theatrics. Just a slow march through years of routine. In the end, the record put Richard on the wrong side of the verdict on racketeering counts tied to illegal gambling, loan collection at unlawful rates, extortion of cash-heavy businesses, and laundering that cleaned up proceeds. He received a federal prison sentence and began serving time. The move from corner booths to visiting rooms is not something anyone prepares for easily. But men from that world tend to accept it. They keep their voice even, learn the rhythm of the place, read, write, and wait. Family members visited when they could. Holidays passed with phone calls scheduled to the minute. News from the outside came in small packages. A new baby, a wedding, a cousin's illness, a neighbor's store closing, a favorite diner changing hands. Back home, the city kept moving. Crews adjusted. Some people stepped up, others stepped away. The broader organization restructured under different names at the top, as the government pressed new rounds of charges against parts of the hierarchy still on the street. Cooperators who had once kept silence took the stand, expecting shorter sentences in return, and their accounts added new layers to old stories. A nephew remained under watch because of his last name and past associations. In that environment, even legitimate business moves drew extra eyes. The surname itself acted like a beacon for agents with open files and time to make calls. looking back at the arc that led from small errands on neighborhood blocks to a federal case. The through line is not mystery but habit. Keep the money moving. Keep tensions low. Keep conversations short. Keep records coded or off paper entirely. That strategy worked until it didn't. Technology improved, laws evolved, and the pool of people willing to testify widened. A street that once felt like a village became a web of cameras and microphones that didn't care about reputations. The safe spots, pay phones, busy diners, crowded sidewalks lost their shelter as investigators mapped them over months and years. Still, for a long time, that life ran on human judgment more than anything else. Richard's value, in the view of colleagues and adversaries alike, lay in measured decisions. He didn't throw weight around to prove a point. He weighed costs and looked for the path that kept income steady. That steadiness earned him trust and responsibilities that later appeared on indictment pages as authority. It also made him a target worth the government's time. The same discipline that fueled his ascent helped prosecutors argue that nothing happened in his lane without his say. It's easy to think of headline names as the story and everyone else as background. This life runs the other way. The background is the story. The pickups, the ledger reconciliations, the weekly adjustments, the quiet visits that end with a nod. Richard lived there, in the overlooked routine that made a larger structure function. When the government finally laid out its case, it didn't claim he staged spectacles. It claimed he kept the engine tuned, and it convinced a jury that tuning was a crime when the fuel came from illegal gambling, unlawful loans, and pressure on businesses to pay for peace. The record ends that chapter with a number of years served and a life resumed under closer watch than before. In a city that never stops turning over its awnings and repainting its storefronts, people who return after long absences learn to spot what changed and what didn't. Friends move, restaurants close, familiar blocks fill with new faces. Obligations remain, families remain, and memories remain of days when a man could walk the avenue and decide, over a coffee gone cold, who to call next and what problem to solve before sunset. Back inside, routine became its own kind of map. Wake when the lights came on, fold the blanket neat, line up for count, stretch, read the notice board, and keep the day simple. There was a quiet to that life that someone like him could tolerate. He preferred order, and the place provided it whether you wanted it or not. He spent hours in the library, not only on cases and motions, but on newspapers and history books. He read about the city he couldn't walk, and traced its changes through headlines and photos. He made notes on yellow pads, wrote letters with small, even handwriting, and kept his conversations measured on the phone. Visits came and went. Sometimes it was family, sometimes an old friend who had business out in that part of the world anyway. They talked about kids, health, and home repairs. No one raised voices. Time passed without scenes. His legal team worked in steady rhythm too. They filed notices, fought over discovery, argued about wiretap phrasing and how to interpret small, coded remarks. They said a simple phrase could mean 10 different things, and that a lunch at a corner diner in Queens proved nothing by itself. Prosecutors answered with charts, timelines, and the testimony of people who had decided to cooperate. The appeals that followed were patient, precise, and slow-moving. They rarely reversed everything. They tended to shave edges, adjust a term, or leave the whole structure intact with a few notes. He accepted that. Lawyers did their jobs. He did his. Day to day inside, he kept to a small circle. A man who liked low noise found it best not to trade stories in the yard. He walked laps, kept to himself, and quietly mediated small disputes when someone asked. That habit transferred easily from one world to the other. Keep tempers low, find a schedule, avoid messes that couldn't be cleaned. He wrote lists the way he always had, tasks wrapped in shorthand that only made sense to him. At night, he fell asleep quickly. In places like that, sleep is currency, and he saved it for as long as he could. News of home reached him in a rhythm that matched the outside world's seasons. Fall meant school photos and talk of cold weather. Winter meant holidays lined up on a calendar and calls arranged around visiting hours. Spring meant a first game at a local field and someone's graduation. Summers carried stories about families meeting in backyards and a cousin complaining about traffic to the beach. The names changed with age, but the pattern remained. He carried those notes into his reading and let them soften the edges of concrete and steel. On the outside, The streets he once walked adjusted to new pressures. Old social clubs closed, replaced by storefronts that sold shoes or phone plans. Some bars that had kept machines in the back went dry or changed hands. Newcomers opened cafes where the coffee came with menus in chalk handwriting. The structure that supported his old work didn't vanish entirely, it bent and rerouted. Smaller crews found new covers under different businesses. Some long-running schemes faded as technology left them behind. People found fresh angles where cash still flowed. Small events, nightlife, delivery routes, online wagers handled by offshore outfits that changed names every season. The city never stopped inventing ways to make money, and people who understood pressure never stopped looking for leverage. Even with so much change, certain habits didn't disappear. Cash-heavy storefronts still preferred quiet days. Owners of small places still wanted steady deliveries and a sense that nothing would go sideways at closing time. The language for those arrangements softened, but the effect stayed recognizable. A payment labeled something polite, a promise that everything would remain calm. Investigators learned to look not for a single threat, but for a pattern. Checks cut on the same day each month to a company with a bland name and a mail dropped 2 neighborhoods away. A set of visits that never varied, a supplier that became stubborn if the extra invoice went unpaid. The more the city modernized, the more the work of mapping it followed the same old rules: watch, wait, compare, and build a picture out of small, repeated acts. When his release date drew near, he kept expectations modest. Men who knew the drill warned new arrivals against planning more than a meal and a long walk. He listened. The first day out always feels bigger than it is. There's the sun, the air, the noise, the feeling of clocks moving at a proper pace again. Then there's a table with plates laid out by people who love you, and a visit from an old friend who keeps it short and leaves before dessert. He appreciated the quiet welcome. He had nothing to prove to anyone who mattered. Supervised release came with rules, and he honored them. Meetings with officers ran on schedule. Travel needed permission. Phones had to stay open. He treated those conditions like business hours and built an old man's routine around them. Morning coffee from the same corner shop, short errands, afternoons at home, and evenings with family. He paid attention to who waved on the block and who didn't. He noticed which storefronts had changed and which held steady. He had aged into a presence more than a figure. People said hello because they knew his relatives, or remembered his name from papers or whispered stories. He didn't linger where cameras gathered. From the outside, some tried to fold every Gotti into one story. It was easier that way, an all-purpose headline. But the city knows better. John was the marquee, Gene carried his own history, Peter had his time at the top under pressure, and Richard did the middle work that drew fewer cameras until the day his name appeared on a charging sheet. Each took a different path through the same world, shaped by the same early blocks. Richard's path stayed focused on revenue streams that turned quarters into envelopes and promissory notes into regular cash. Whatever else people wanted to believe, that was the lane where prosecutors said he built most of his influence, and that's where a jury found him responsible. The younger generation learned different lessons. Some looked at the old life and saw a future. Others saw a warning. A few tried to mix both, keeping one foot in, legitimate trades, and the other on the edge of that shadow economy. Those who stayed clean found peace in the kind of security that doesn't bring agents to the door at dawn. Those who strayed learned, all over again, that cameras now fit in the palm of a hand, and that deals whispered in parking lots echo louder than ever in court. Richard's example could be read either way, a demonstration of how to keep things quiet, or a demonstration of how, in the end, quiet wasn't enough. New York's law enforcement machine didn't stop grinding because one man returned home. It kept rolling forward with new cases, sweeping up remnants of old crews and fresh faces trying to fill gaps. Agents who had studied gambling books moved on to digital ledgers and text messages. Auditors who once compared check stubs now compared app payouts. Prosecutors built narratives that looked familiar even when the tools changed. Extortion still meant pressure. Loan schemes still meant weekly payments that never seemed to end. Money laundering still meant turning soft green into numbers that could sit in a bank. The vocabulary shifted. The core remained. He spent a lot of time with family. Birthdays meant pizza boxes on a kitchen table and grandkids asking him for stories about what the neighborhood used to be like. He talked about stickball, Sunday gravy, older men who remembered faces better than names, and the way summers smelled like fire hydrants and hot sidewalks. If they asked about the other parts, he kept details short and honest. He made choices that carried consequences. He looked after people he was responsible for, and he paid for those choices. He didn't dress it up, and he didn't make speeches about loyalty. He let the facts stand. Every so often, an old friend stopped by with news about someone from the past. The rooms where people once met were now a boutique or a gallery. A diner nobody thought would close had turned into a pharmacy. Blocks that were once claimed by one crew or another were now a mix of strollers, scooters, and delivery bikes. He absorbed those notes with the same calm he brought to everything else. The city changes. You change with it, or you step aside. He had already paid in full for his part. He was content to sit on a bench and watch the dog walkers pass. When local reporters reached out for a quote, he usually declined. If he spoke at all, he stuck to polite sentences about family and routine. He did not revisit the old days for entertainment value. He hadn't told stories to cameras when he was younger. He wasn't going to start now. Those who wanted drama could buy a ticket to a movie. Those who wanted history could read court records. He didn't owe anyone a version that made him look larger than he was. People who worked cases against him described him, years later, with a grudging respect. They called him steady, careful, and businesslike. They said he avoided chaos, and that's what made the rackets he managed profitable for as long as they lasted. That same steadiness helped the government build a case. Routines are reliable for everyone, including investigators. When you make the same rounds every week, it's easier to be there waiting. When you adjust the same percentages in the same way for years, it's easier to chart them. He had built an efficient system. It just wasn't built to withstand the weight of time and technology. The list of what he actually did, as laid out in charging papers and verdict forms, reads plainly. He supervised illegal gambling operations that took action on games and horses, with bookmakers and runners feeding a central tally he kept an eye on. He authorized and collected on high-interest loans made to people in tight spots, payments due weekly, and adjusted to keep debtors paying. He approved the collection of fees from businesses that, in exchange, didn't have to worry about trouble at their doors or damage to their property. He helped shape the movement of proceeds through companies and accounts designed to make those funds look ordinary. These were not isolated episodes, but ongoing systems. That's why the government called it racketeering, not a single act, but a pattern that produced money month after month. Years after he came home, his days settled into something quiet and ordinary. He took short walks after breakfast and longer ones when the weather cooperated. He watched ball games on TV with the sound a little low. He kept appointments, paid bills, and left the city to someone else's ambitions. Whatever influence he once exerted faded into memory, a line in a story the city had read before and would read again with different names. If a stranger passed him on the street, they saw an older man with careful posture and a familiar last name. If they asked around, they heard facts without embellishment. He was part of that world. He did his time. And now he keeps to his business. He knew there was no going back to what the past looked like because the past never looks the same twice. The clubs, the paper ledgers, the phone booths, the back booths in diners with the same cheap coffee, those belonged to another era. The old strategies had grown brittle. A life that once counted on anonymity in a crowd now had to reckon with cameras tucked into doorbells and microphones on every corner. In a sense, his return was a lesson. Longevity in that life depended on avoiding attention, and attention had become unavoidable. The city had outgrown the shadows he once used. Toward the end of the story people tell about him, there isn't a twist waiting around a corner. He wasn't trying to stage a comeback or audition for an audience. He was content to be one of many names tied to a time when cash moved in envelopes and business got settled with a nod. The real weight of his life sits not in a single episode, but in the steady accumulation of small decisions that, taken together, shaped who paid what, when, and to whom. It was a life built on structure, maintained by routine, and defined, in public records, by violations that courts recognized and punished. He understood that. He lived with it. And in the quieter years, he chose small comforts over old patterns, and let the city keep its noise while he kept his peace. He had learned to move through New York in a way that drew little notice, and that habit never left him. Even later, when he kept close to home and stuck to predictable hours, his mind still organized a day as a set of tasks. He measured time by appointments, errands, and small responsibilities. If he sat by a window with coffee, he watched the street the way he always had. Who knew whom? Who stopped to talk? Who kept walking? Which delivery van came on which day? The reflex came from long years when details paid the bills. That outlook had carried him from small favors to larger roles, and in the end, placed him in the center of a record that prosecutors assembled piece by piece. To understand his lane, it helps to rewind to the seasons before the headlines. The brothers grew up moving between tough blocks that taught self-reliance. Some boys from those blocks found steady union jobs. Some chased city tests. Some fell into corner economies that ran on cash and discretion. In that world, a person's value came from doing what he said he would do, and keeping his voice even when others got loud. Richard built a reputation as someone you could trust with routine work that mattered. Reconciling numbers from bookmakers, smoothing out a problem with a bar owner, making sure machines in the back of a tavern stayed where they were welcome and moved when they weren't. He never tried to be a public figure. That was someone else's role. He preferred quiet lanes that required consistency. By the late 1970s and into the 1980s, the family structure rewarded people who could keep revenue stable. The bigger names handled leadership and politics. Others kept the engine humming. According to agents who later testified, Richard fit the second group. He dealt with what the law calls illegal gambling. Bookmakers taking action on sports and horses, runners collecting bets, and a central tally that someone had to oversee. He also oversaw high-interest lending, the kind built around cash loans that came due weekly, and the kind of protection payments that showed up as fees in a local business's books. When disputes arose, he directed men he trusted to resolve them without creating a scene. People who worked under him learned to show up on time, speak plainly, and bring back results without flair. The spotlight in those years swung to his brother, who took the top seat after a tumultuous change in 1985. Cameras followed that ascension, camped outside clubs, and turned social visits into front-page material. Richard stayed out of that frame. He handled neighborhoods where money changed hands quietly. When the Ravenite Social Club became a magnet for reporters and agents, he preferred diners in Queens and short walks on streets where he had known faces for decades. The public saw suits walking into Little Italy. Investigators saw receipts, ledgers, and envelopes tied to places 2 boroughs away. Over time, those small entries in binders added his initials to charts that didn't show up on TV. The kinds of businesses connected to his work looked ordinary from the sidewalk. A pub that drew regulars, a luncheonette that ran breakfast all day, a small night spot with a few machines buzzing in the back, a club that hosted card nights for regulars who liked action. In each place, someone got a cut for making sure the machines stayed, the envelopes arrived, or the bookmakers' runners didn't face unexpected trouble. Those relationships weren't drawn in ink on a contract. They were understood and kept because breaking them invited headaches. When an owner felt squeezed, he might ask for a pause, and someone like Richard weighed the request against the risk of losing the stream entirely. The aim, always, was to keep the flow active without generating noise that drew the law. Money laundering, as described later in filings, gave that cash a surface it could travel on. A company with a plain name and a modest address billed for services that were hard to measure. A check got written. The funds moved through one more account and then returned to the world as payroll, vendor payments, or purchases that looked ordinary enough. Sometimes, cash went through check cashers. Sometimes it got redeposited in small amounts to avoid attention. This was the quiet part of the job, turning messy dollars into neat digits. Prosecutors would later argue that Richard had a seasoned hand in this process, steering it so that no single person held the whole picture, and no single account grew fat enough to glow on a banker's screen. If leadership wanted to avoid attention to narcotics, men like him leaned on the other streams with more rigor. Gambling and loans were predictable if managed carefully. The rules were simple. Don't expand faster than your ability to collect. Don't let debtors collapse. Don't leave machines where they'll be seized twice. Adjust lines to spread risk. Rotate meeting spots often enough that nothing looks fixed. Talk in ways that mean something to the people in the room and nothing to anyone playing a tape later. For years, those rules worked. They didn't make anyone rich overnight. They kept a crew paid and reduced the odds of sudden drama. The government, for its part, also developed habits that paid off. It learned to bring overlapping tools to a single case. Wiretaps granted under Title III, physical surveillance, financial audits, and the testimony of people who decided to cooperate after facing time of their own. Agents paired license plates with phone records, set up cameras near payphones, cross-checked bank deposits against dates when envelopes were seen traded at a table. The picture that emerged didn't depend on a single recording. It depended on repetition. The same bar on the same day, the same phrase tied to the same task, the same man seen leaving after the same pickup. John's conviction in 1992 rewired the family's chart. Acting roles shifted, disputes surfaced, and men who had done steady work were asked to take on more. Through that period, Richard's name appeared in internal law enforcement summaries as a man with authority in Queens. The sort of authority that allowed him to set priorities and decide which collectors handled which routes. He wasn't at the center of the press storm, but he sat close enough to direct parts of the business that mattered. The record later constructed around him focuses on routine activities. Illegal gambling proceeds collected and reported, loans made at unlawful rates and enforced, and money moved through accounts and companies that had little to do with the services on their letterheads. By 2001 and 2002, pressure peaked again. Federal prosecutors in the Eastern District of New York brought sweeping racketeering charges against members and associates they tied to the Gambino family's current operations. Those papers named men from different crews and outlined a structure where oversight fell to capos responsible for neighborhoods and lanes of income. Richard was identified in that context, and his son, Richard G., appeared in some of those filings too. The counts described illegal gambling, extortion of cash-heavy businesses, loan sharking, and laundering. They were not colorful. They were methodical. The narrative marched through dates, phone calls, and the testimony of people who said they worked under the defendants and followed their directions. He faced those charges in a courtroom that had seen many like it. Prosecutors walked jurors through code words and schedules. They played brief tapes where common phrases meant something specific in context. Owners of small businesses described paying fees they couldn't decline. Bookmakers explained how their numbers moved through a chain and how disputes over late money reached a supervisor whose approval mattered. Agents showed photographs and matched them to phone records. Auditors explained bank entries. Defense counsel cross-examined hard, hammered at weaknesses, raised doubts about cooperators' motives, and reminded everyone that a short conversation in a restaurant isn't a crime by itself. The legal standard still required proof beyond a reasonable doubt. In the end, jurors found the pattern strong enough to convict him of racketeering offenses tied to the activities described. Sentencing drew on the guidelines that weigh leadership roles, scope of conduct, and prior history. The judge calculated a range, considered the evidence, and imposed a term measured in years, not months. The court also ordered forfeiture tied to proceeds of the crimes proven, a standard part of federal racketeering cases that aims to strip away financial benefit. He began serving time. The transition from fieldwork to a controlled environment is stark, but he adjusted the way detail-oriented men often do. He kept schedules, stayed quiet, read, and kept a small circle. He accepted visits, took calls on a fixed clock, and let the days stack into seasons. He filed appeals that chipped at narrow issues without changing the basic outcome. Outside, the world moved ahead. John died in 2002, a fact that reshaped family conversations and public interest. Peter faced his own legal battles and sentences. Other relatives navigated their lives under a name that drew attention no one asked for. Across the city, new crews tried to rise as old structures thinned. Technology accelerated change. Gambling went online. Phones became pocket computers. Cameras appeared on stoops and dashboards. Some of the old rackets survived in smaller forms. Others shifted shape. The main lessons remained. Pressure generates money, and pressure generates scrutiny. Those two facts chased each other through the boroughs. When he came home, he did not try to reclaim old roles. Age, law, and the changed city drew hard borders. He followed supervision rules and avoided places that drew press or people curious for a story. Relatives and close friends filled his calendar. He ate at familiar spots that were still around, and tried new ones where the staff didn't do double takes at his last name. He went to family events. He paid attention to health. He let younger people carry their own weight, and didn't hand out advice unless asked. If someone pressed him for anecdotes about earlier days, he kept his answers short and factual. He had already lived the consequences. There was nothing left to win by revisiting old business. The public record of what he did is straightforward. He rose from small neighborhood work to become a made member, and then a captain in the Gambino family, as presented by prosecutors and confirmed by verdicts. He supervised illegal gambling operations that took wagers and produced steady cash. He directed loan collections on debts that accrued harsh interest, making sure payments arrived weekly. He oversaw the collection of regular payments from businesses that preferred quiet to trouble. He participated in moving proceeds through bank accounts and shell companies so that funds looked legitimate on paper. These weren't isolated missteps, but coordinated activities repeated over time. That is why the law grouped them under racketeering. It is not glamorous. It is a description of how a shadow economy sustains itself. If you strip away the myths, what remains is a man who made a career inside that structure by being steady and serious. His brother's public persona never fit him. He didn't court headlines and didn't play to crowds. He relied on routines and expected results. That approach earned him responsibility and, later, put his name on charging pages that described him as a supervisor. He spent the years required by the sentence. He returned to ordinary routines. In the eyes of the law, that completed the arc. Conduct proved, punishment served, and a life resumed under watch. People who knew him before and after described similar traits. He didn't shout. He paid attention. He kept schedules. He believed in letting small things stay small. Those qualities made him good at a job the government defined as crime, and those same qualities helped him survive the process that followed. In the end, his story reads like a ledger. It records obligations assumed, payments collected, risks managed, investigations assembled, charges tried, time served, and a quiet return. It is not a tale built on spectacle. It is a record of steady choices that shaped a path through a city that always notices, even when it looks away. He moved through days with the patience of someone who had learned to survive by reading rooms and keeping steady habits. Age softened his stride, but not his way of tracking small things. He noticed who waved first, which shop opened early, how delivery trucks paused at hydrants, and when the corner filled with school kids. That attention had once kept collections smooth and tempers low. Later, it kept life simple. He sat by a window, drank coffee that cooled faster than he expected, and watched a block that had given him both a livelihood and a price to pay. Decades earlier, before the big cases hardened into verdicts, the work he supervised didn't look theatrical. It ran on bookmakers who took action on games and ponies, runners who gathered bets, and a tally that rose or fell with a weekend's outcomes. It extended to machines that blinked in the backs of bars and cafes, cabinets that spit coins and soaked up small bills, installed under arrangements that suited both owner and crew as long as profits stayed predictable. It included loans made to people who needed cash on short notice, debts that grew by the week and were adjusted so they never collapsed. None of that required speeches or scenes. It required schedules, patience, and a willingness to renegotiate just enough to keep the money moving. Richard Vincent Gotti fit that lane. Investigators, in time, described him as a made man who became a captain, with authority over operations in parts of Queens and nearby suburbs. They said he decided which collectors handled which routes, which bookmakers fed which sheet, and when to ease up on a small business so the stream wouldn't dry out. He preferred conversations that didn't last long, code words that meant something only to people who had heard them before, and meetings that started with sports and ended with assignments. The picture in reports wasn't of a braggart. It was of a supervisor with a calm style. The neighborhood taught him early how to balance loyalty and caution. He grew up in crowded rooms where siblings jostled for space, and parents stretched dollars. Older brothers found work in the orbit of crews that looked after their blocks, collected on debts, and kept disputes out of public view. That world valued reliability. If you promised a delivery on Thursday, you arrived on Thursday. If a bar owner needed an extra week, you waited. Not as charity, but as math. A short delay to preserve a long stream. Richard kept that arithmetic in his head. He knew that a quiet adjustment could prevent a phone call that raised alarms. When leadership changed in 1985 and cameras swarmed Little Italy, he stayed off center stage. His brother's rise to boss drew national attention. Reporters camped outside the Ravenite. The city learned names it had never said aloud. Richard avoided that storm. He met people at diners in Queens, walked blocks he had known since his 20s, and ran earnings that didn't make headlines. Agents noticed anyway. They charted pickups, logged license plates, matched short calls to quick meetings, and slowly filled binders with snapshots of a pattern that mattered more than any single episode. The crew economy he managed depended on places that looked ordinary. A tavern with a jukebox, a restaurant that sold slices by the dozen, a club that hosted weekly card nights, a bar where regulars watched ball games, machines in corners hummed, runners came and went. Envelopes changed hands folded inside newspapers. Owners counted on a stable routine. No vandalism, no disruptions. No sudden visits from strangers asking too many questions. Money moved from those rooms to collectors, from collectors to a trusted middle, and from there to him and beyond. Each step took a cut. The last portion went upward as tribute, a practice older than anyone in the room. He treated money laundering like plumbing, not a puzzle. Cash entered as green bills and left as numbers attached to an invoice from a company with an unremarkable name. The service described on paper was vague enough to escape curiosity. Checks flowed through one account, then another. Small deposits kept attention low. Sometimes a check casher bridged the gap, trading paper for fees. Prosecutors later said he helped guide those flows, so that no single node carried too much load, and no account swelled enough to glow under a banker's software. That spread risk and gave the money a surface it could travel without splashing. The early 1,990 seconds shook the structure. John's conviction and life sentence removed the lightning rod that had absorbed attention, and without him the organization worked to avoid fractures. Acting titles shifted. Some men grew louder, others quieted. In that rebalancing, reliable earners mattered. Richard's role, as described in later filings, stabilized gambling streams, kept loan collections on pace, and held machine routes together as raids forced relocations. He became a known name in summaries written by federal agents who tracked who spoke with whom and which instructions reached which street. By the late 1,990 seconds, technology began to erode the old shelters. Payphones disappeared. Prepaid cells helped for a while. Then call records and location data complicated that comfort. Cameras popped up above store doors and on street corners. Still, the core of what he oversaw remained familiar. Machines, books, debts, envelopes, meetings. When police seized cabinets from a set of bars, replacements appeared with different labels in other rooms. When a debtor started slipping, terms shifted to keep him working and paying. You could keep a man on a hook for years if you didn't pull too hard. That was experience talking, not virtue. The government built its answer in layers: cooperating witnesses, wiretaps, bank records, and photographs. They collected forms from shell companies, matched them against deposits, and recruited accountants who could explain to jurors how a string of round numbers often signals cash hidden in plain sight. They placed agents at distances that captured faces and posture but not voices. Tapes covered the rest. A phrase that sounded harmless on a first listen took on meaning when paired with ledgers. No single piece carried the whole weight. The structure of the case did. In one large sweep in the early 2000s, prosecutors in the Eastern District named him among defendants tied to the Gambino family's still-running rackets. The case spanned illegal gambling, extortion, loan sharking, and money laundering. It mapped a hierarchy that placed him in a supervisory seat, and it listed his son among co-defendants in some counts. The charges were not cinematic. They were administrative. They talked about calendar days, scheduled pickups, predictable sums, and coded calls. They alleged that he approved collections, resolved disputes, and ensured proceeds reached higher offices. In court, he faced the government's version of his work. Witnesses who once reported to him described routes, handoffs, and the way a call from upstairs could change a weekly number. Small business owners explained how a service fee bought a calm front window. Bookmakers told jurors about risk, how lines moved to manage exposure, and how a supervisor kept losses tolerable across a long season. Agents pointed to photographs and paired them with short calls where phrases like, "Bring the list," marked collections, not groceries. Defense counsel pressed hard, underscoring the gaps, the motives of cooperators, and the ambiguity of street talk. The jury heard months of patient assembly and delivered guilty verdicts on racketeering counts connected to the activities described. The sentence reflected leadership role and scope. Years followed. Forfeiture orders targeted sums the court tied to proven conduct. He entered a system that runs on clocks and counts, and he adapted. He kept his circle small, and his voice even. He read, walked, wrote letters, and stayed in touch with family on schedules that never changed. Appeals raised issues of interpretation and procedure. They did not overturn the core result. He accepted the process the way he had accepted work schedules. One day at a time, no wasted moves. News from home filtered through calls and visits. John's death in 2002 closed a chapter that had dominated newspaper columns for a decade. Peter faced his own punishments. Jean served long years related to narcotics, a lane the family had publicly denied but which the record ultimately showed. Nephews navigated careers while carrying a last name that could open doors or close them, depending on who heard it. The neighborhood itself shifted. Longtime bars changed hands. Storefronts turned into salons, then into phone shops, then into cafes with chalkboard menus. The street rolled forward. When he returned, he built a different rhythm. He respected supervision terms, met with officers when told, and kept his travel narrow. He saw relatives, tended to health, and stayed away from rooms that drew attention. He left the stage to other people. Neighbors who recognized him sometimes offered a handshake and a memory. He answered with politeness and moved on. He wasn't campaigning for relevance, and he wasn't trying to relitigate old disputes. He had done what the court required. That was enough. People often ask why some names in that world grow loud, while others remain footnotes until an indictment surfaces. The answer, in his case, sits in the kind of work he did. Headlines prefer spectacle. His lane produced revenue. He supervised collections, adjusted terms, placed machines, and made sure envelopes arrived. That wasn't camera work. It was background. Background, however, is what keeps a structure standing. And that's why investigators spent years learning it so they could show a jury how the money really moved. There is an unavoidable tension when telling a life like his. Some want a fable, either a warning or a legend. He didn't live either extreme. He followed a system that existed long before he joined it, and continued after he stepped away. He shaped parts of it quietly. He benefited from it, and paid for it. The government presented proof that he supervised illegal gambling operations, approved and enforced loans with illegal interest, oversaw the extraction of payments from businesses in exchange for peace, and helped move proceeds through accounts and companies designed to look ordinary. The court agreed. He served his sentence. He came home and kept a low profile. What sets his story apart from dramatized versions is repetition. Real cases hinge on routine. The same diner at the same hour, the same route on Tuesdays and Thursdays, the same envelope folded the same way. Investigators learned those loops and waited inside them. The habits that made him valuable made him visible to people who had time to watch. He had built a smooth engine. The smoother it ran, the easier it was to hear. Age changed his pace, but not his clarity. He knew that the old strategies no longer worked in a city lined with doorbell cameras and phones that tracked themselves. The places where he had once met people now had bright lights and open floor plans, too many eyes and too many lenses. He accepted that the world had moved on. He focused on family. He told grandchildren about stickball, old radio shows, and long summers on sidewalks when the hydrant opened and the whole block laughed. If asked about the other parts, he gave the kind of answer a pragmatic man gives. He made decisions. The law called them crimes. He faced that, and he lives quietly now. His legacy inside that world is not a single scene. It's an approach. Keep tempers low, keep schedules tight, keep conversations brief, keep money moving along paths that don't draw heat. That approach built his reputation and, later, formed the backbone of cases against him. People who worked with him called him steady. Agents who pursued him said the same. In different ways, both sides recognized the same trait. It is rare to see adversaries agree. They did in his case, and that agreement says more than any headline could. In the end, the story of Richard Vincent Gotti is part of the city's larger story about shadow economies that run alongside legitimate commerce. Cash businesses generate opportunity and risk. Men who can manage both become important, even if they never step into a camera's frame. He rose in that system, supervised key revenue streams, answered to higher offices, and, when the record caught up, took the sentence that followed. He returned to a quieter life and let the city keep telling itself new tales with new names. The old routes still exist in memory, but the man who once walked them now prefers a shorter path. A coffee, a short walk, a seat by the window, and the satisfaction of a day that ends without a call he needs to return. He does not dispute the past or dress it up. He doesn't claim wisdom where there was only experience. He recognizes that what once looked like skill now reads like evidence in a file. He gave structure to a corner of an organization that valued structure above noise, and the very order he valued became the shape that prosecutors traced line by line. That's the sober truth of his record. Not glamorous, not mysterious, simply the accumulation of choices that turned into a career the law could define, measure, and punish. And once that was done, he kept moving, slower now, careful as ever, finding calm in ordinary days that don't require anyone else's approval. He carried himself with the practiced calm of a man who knew that routine could be armor. Even in quiet years, he rose early, stepped into the day with small aims, and noticed the invisible choreography on a block. The milk crate stacked at a deli door, the courier who always parked two wheels on the curb, the way a shopkeeper flipped an open sign with a twist of the wrist. That awareness had once protected revenue and eased tensions. Later, it kept his mind sharp and his days grounded. He didn't chase nostalgia. He let memory arrive on its own, usually in the shape of a scent from a bakery or a familiar voice calling across a crosswalk. The shape of his public story rests on records, not rumor. Law enforcement reports, indictments, transcripts, and verdict sheets draw the outline. He was a made member of the Gambino family who rose to captain, managed a crew in and around Queens, and directed earnings from illegal gambling, high-interest loans, and payments collected from cash businesses that wanted peace. He also helped shepherd proceeds through accounts and companies that made funds look ordinary. Those claims weren't guessed at by reporters. They were presented in court by prosecutors using tapes, witnesses, and documents. Defense lawyers fought hard, raising doubts about interpretations and motives. Juries still found him responsible for racketeering acts tied to those revenue streams, and judges handed down sentences that measured years, with forfeiture engineered to claw back the money. He didn't build that position by grabbing headlines. He built it by showing up, keeping conversations short, and adjusting pressure so the line didn't snap. Illegal gambling of the sort he oversaw took steady hands. Bookmakers wrote action on football, basketball, baseball, and horses. Runners collected slips and cash. A central tally-balanced exposure, so no single afternoon could sink a sheet. When too many bettors leaned toward a favorite, lines shifted to flatten risk. Collections followed a calendar, not a mood. That orchestration produced predictable income, as long as everyone understood the rules. No missed pickups, no sloppy talk, no stretches of credit that would turn a debtor into a ghost. Loans at harsh weekly rates formed a second stream. Cash moved fast in that lane. A shop owner covered a gap after a slow month. A bettor patched a bad run. Terms bit hard, but adjustments kept the debtor alive as a payer. Richard was known, in agent summaries and cooperating witness testimony, as the one who approved tweaks to schedules that prevented collapse. He didn't forgive balances. He extended timelines by inches, so the money kept coming. That wasn't kindness, it was arithmetic. The aim was always the same. Keep a debtor on his feet long enough to convert his next month into the crew's next week. Collections labeled as protection lived at the edge of legitimate language. Business owners logged them as service fees, trash, security, supplies, depending on what made books look normal. In practice, the payment bought calm. It kept windows intact and deliveries predictable. It also bought recourse when a problem arrived from a different direction. A phone call to the right number solved things that might otherwise linger and scare customers. Affidavits and trial testimony later translated that quiet into legal terms. To prosecutors, routine payments under pressure met the definition of extortion. To owners who had lived with those bills for years, skipping them felt like a gamble they couldn't afford. The fourth lane was the one that turned cash into paper. Money laundering in his orbit relied on plain names, modest addresses, and invoices that no auditor could disprove with a walkthrough. Funds moved through accounts in amounts small enough to avoid automated alarms, then reappeared as payroll or vendor checks. Sometimes money stopped at a check casher. Sometimes it took a detour through a relative's company. The success of that path depended on spreading risk and avoiding patterns so neat that software could find them. Agents and accountants countered with patience. They matched deposits to dates of surveillance, looked for round numbers that recurred on Thursdays, and traced payments that traveled in a tight loop across months. When they laid it out in court, the path looked obvious because it had been walked for so long. Those were the mechanics. The context was a city that changed faster than memory. The early 1,990 saw a wave of landmark convictions that reorganized leadership and emboldened investigators. John's case was the biggest headline. His conviction and death in custody woke a broader public to the difference between image and operation. Inside the family, the effect was practical. People took new seats. Others moved in from the edges. Routine earners like Richard assumed more weight, because when a crown brings heat, the survival of the structure depends on people who can keep money flowing without theater. He did that. That's why his name appears in summaries written by agents who charted mid-level decisions across years. The push and pull with law enforcement evolved too. The 1,980 playbook relied on bugs in clubs, cameras on corners, and the occasional undercover. The 1,990 and 2000s added better wiretaps, smarter financial analysis, and a growing pool of cooperators. People who once would have kept quiet decided to talk after facing long guidelines ranges. Their words didn't stand alone. They were backed by photographs, phone logs, bank records, and coded notebooks. When a cooperator explained that the list meant pickups and after lunch meant a precise hour on a certain avenue, tapes and surveillance put faces to the glossary. Defense counsel pushed back hard, reminding jurors that slang isn't science and that witnesses on the government side had their own incentives. The case is turned not on a single dramatic tape, but on the accumulation of small, repetitive acts that the law understands as a pattern. The big sweep that brought him into court around 2002 fit that mold. The charging papers ran long with dates, places, and roles. They mapped a hierarchy: bosses, acting bosses, street bosses, capos, soldiers, associates. In that framework, he appeared as a captain who directed earnings from Queens into the larger pool. His son surfaced in some counts, a reality that complicated family life and news coverage. Reporters who had written about the surname for years now had fresh names to print. Inside the courtroom, the government stuck to its ledger. Illegal gambling, extortion, loan sharking, laundering. The words repeated like drumbeats as witnesses walked through the mechanics, and agents explained why a Tuesday morning at a specific diner, paired with a phone call at 9/7, mattered more than it seemed. The verdicts ended arguments. Guilty on racketeering counts tied to the activities described. The sentence reflected a leadership role and the scope of operations. Forfeiture orders forced the return of proceeds the court linked to the case. He went into federal custody. He coped the way he had lived, by shrinking life into workable pieces. Wake early. Keep to a small circle. Read. Write. Walk. Call family. Don't waste effort on complaints that change nothing. Appeals pressed points that could be pressed. They did not erase the core result. He served his time. Time doesn't stand still outside. Technology erased payphones and rolled surveillance into every pocket. Gambling migrated online. And then, years later, into regulated frameworks in some states. Brick-and-mortar machines didn't vanish, but the climate around them changed. Cash businesses learned new ways to explain numbers. Law enforcement learned new ways to test those explanations. As the city's economy modernized, the investigators' approach adapted. The core ideas stayed. Follow the money, decode the talk, match faces to dates, and build a picture through repetition rather than spectacle. Back home under supervision, he lived like a man who understood that every day brought a choice between quiet and noise. He chose quiet. Meetings with officers happened on schedule. Travel requests were modest. He kept away from places that drew cameras. Family filled the calendar. Birthdays, graduations, small dinners with people who had saved seats for him through the hard years. He answered questions about the past with brevity and without romance. He did not offer himself as a cautionary tale or a legend. He let the record, imperfect as it might be, stand for itself. People in law enforcement who had worked his cases described him later with words that echoed one another. Careful, disciplined, businesslike. Those who had worked under him used some of the same language. That alignment is rare. It reflects a truth about his value inside that world and his vulnerability in court. Habits built trust. The same habits drew lines investigators could follow. If your collectors hit the same route on Tuesdays and Thursdays, cameras only needed to learn the corners. If you adjusted a debtor's rate by a quarter point the same way each time, auditors could prove pattern and intent. If a shell company billed the same clients in the same amounts each month, a spreadsheet would sing. The family story sits in the background of all this. A father who worked hard for not much. A mother who held a crowded home together. Siblings who scattered into different versions of the same neighborhood story. John's glare bent the light. It didn't define every life that carried the name. Peter took his turn in the hierarchy, and then in court. Gene's narcotics case contradicted public denials and added years to his time away. Richard's path never chased the podium. He stayed in the lanes the government later proved: gambling operations, collections on unlawful loans, steady extractions from businesses, and the movement of proceeds into accounts that hid origins. That is the real story, messy and plain at once. He didn't spend later years trying to rewrite it. He paid attention to his health, made time for the youngest in the family, and let the city evolve without him. The social clubs became cafes. The old bars turned into family restaurants with bright walls and clean menus. Streets that once carried lady-night murmurs now filled with joggers at dawn. He watched changes with the tolerance of someone who had seen many versions of New York. He didn't rail at it. He didn't pine for a past that had carried its own costs. Law enforcement never stops turning pages. New names replaced old ones on charging sheets. Cases grew out of shipping, construction, sanitation, restaurants, night spots, and the digital shadow where betting and lending moved to screens. Prosecutors in Brooklyn and Manhattan kept refining the same approach that had worked on him. Gather the small pieces, protect the record, translate coded talk, and show a jury how ordinary acts line up into a forbidden pattern. Defense lawyers kept swinging, as they must. Sometimes they won. Often they narrowed losses. The system ground on, indifferent to fame. What remains then, when the noise fades, is a straightforward record. He rose in a criminal organization and supervised revenue that the law forbids. He managed illegal gambling books, loan collections at unlawful rates, payments extracted from businesses, and the laundering of proceeds. He faced charges that captured those acts under the racketeering statute. He was convicted. He served the sentence. He came home, complied with supervision, and lived quietly. That is not cinema. It is history, as told by allegations tested in courtrooms, rebutted by counsel, and finally weighed by juries. He knew, better than most, that success in that life depended on remaining unseen, and that the city had become a place where unseen is difficult. Doorbells watch. Intersections listen. Phones remember. The old rule, never write it down, lost power when every device writes by default. Younger men who tried to walk the same lanes learned that lesson with less leeway than he had. He didn't point fingers or lecture them. He let time and headlines teach what they would. When the youngest asked what the neighborhood used to feel like, he talked about stickball and stoops, about the sound of an L train and the taste of an egg cream on a hot day. If they pressed for the other story, he told them what the court had already told the world. He made choices. He earned money from arrangements the law prohibits. He faced prosecution. He served the time, and he returned to a smaller life. He didn't pass along a script. He didn't frame it as destiny. He presented it as a set of decisions that produced outcomes nobody could erase. That candor spare, unadorned, matched the way he had always moved. When he worked, he kept the engine smooth. When he was charged, he fought where he could and took the result when he had to. When he came home, he stayed out of the way. In every phase, he favored control of the few things a person can control: tone, timing, and attention to detail. In the end, those habits gave him the only victory available to someone with his record. A quiet stretch of years in which the city's relentless motion could be observed without being carried along by it. So the street returns to the ordinary. Trucks doubly park, a corner store opens. A passerby recognizes a last name, nods, and keeps walking. Inside an apartment, a man who once balanced ledgers that should not have existed pours coffee, checks a watch, and straightens a stack of mail. The past doesn't vanish. It simply stops taking up so much room in the day. The facts remain in files. The lessons about routine, about pressure, about the patience of the law remain in the city's bloodstream. He lives with both, neither hiding nor celebrating, and lets the next hour be the only one that matters. He liked ordinary days because they asked so little and gave back plenty. A cup of coffee that stayed warm, a chair by a window, a neighborhood that moved at a pace he understood. Those were enough. He followed a routine that had no room for surprises. He checked in when he was supposed to, kept appointments on time, and treated small errands like promises. He had lived the other way, with a clock built around collections, meetings, and returns. Quiet felt earned. Long before the quiet, his standing came from a kind of reliability that other people could work around. Court records and agent reports described him as a made member who later served as a captain. In that seat, he supervised operations that the law calls racketeering. Illegal gambling on sports and horses, run through bookmakers and runners. High-interest loans collected on a strict calendar, steady payments from cash businesses in exchange for calm. Proceeds passed through companies and accounts that made cash look ordinary. Those categories fill pages and indictments. They also fill hours in a week. What looks like one label in court is, on the street, a lot of small tasks done on time. The gambling stream depended on balance. Bookmakers took action from regulars. Runners moved slips and cash between bettors and the tally. Lines changed to keep risk spread, so no single Sunday or Saturday emptied a sheet. Collections happened without drama. People who had a bad month got a short leash, not a long one. The goal was always to avoid mess. Agents who later took the stand said he approved adjustments and expected reports that told him exposure, collections, and profit, broken down by route. He didn't gamble. He managed gamblers. Loans at steep weekly rates required a different touch. Money moved fast because need makes everything urgent. A shop owner covered inventory after a slow stretch. A bettor tried to patch losses. The numbers grew if the debtor slipped. The only way to keep revenue steady was to prevent collapse. That meant small modifications to a schedule, never a full reset. People later testified that he used phrases like, "give him a little air," meaning stretch a deadline by days, not months. It wasn't generosity. It was a calculation that kept a payer in play. Payments from businesses came with the gentlest language possible. In ledgers, they read as service or consulting fees. In daily life, they bought predictability. No disruptions, no broken glass, no sudden visits from people asking to check the back room. Anyone who ran a bar, club, or cafe counted on steady trade. The wrong kind of attention could scare it away. Owners paid because they had learned the cost of refusing. Prosecutors later used the word extortion. Owners who testified explained the arrangement in plain speech. Paying kept the week smooth. Money laundering turned that income into figures that could sit in a bank without raising questions. It relied on plain company names, bland invoices, and sums small enough to avoid software that flagged patterns. Cash ran through check cashers or a relative's business, then back into accounts that cut payroll or paid vendors. The trick, if there was one, was to spread deposits and avoid a rhythm that a spreadsheet could hum. Investigators, accountants, and agents answered with patience. They lined up dates of deposits with surveillance photos, matched withdrawals to scheduled pickups, and explained to jurors why a string of round numbers isn't how legitimate accounts usually look. As leadership shifted in the early 1990s, people who could keep revenue steady became more important. Headline rolls moved. The pressure stayed. Richard's lane was mid-level oversight. Agent affidavits described him assigning routes, approving who collected where, and moving machines when rooms got hot. He avoided splashy scenes. He kept his part quiet because quiet paid. That style put him in the center of the record when a sweeping case finally arrived. The prosecution that named him mapped a structure from top to bottom. Leadership at the top. Capos directing crews in boroughs and suburbs, soldiers and associates carrying out assignments. Within that chart, the counts against him were familiar. Illegal gambling made money, loans rolled, businesses paid for peace. The proceeds moved through shell companies. The government built its case with taped calls, interviews with cooperators who had worked those routes, photographs of meetings that matched specific phone records, and financial entries that didn't make sense as ordinary sales or services. Defense counsel attacked the edges, questioning motives, parsing words, insisting that a short talk in a diner meant nothing. The jury found that the parts joined into a pattern the law forbids. The sentence reflected his role and the scope of conduct. He went into federal custody and lived by a schedule that, in its own way, suited him. He had always preferred order. Now, order was everywhere. He read, walked, wrote letters, kept phone calls short and steady, and saw family during visiting hours. Appeals focused on how the law should read certain phrases, how tapes were interpreted, and what weight to give to witnesses who had something to gain. Some points narrowed. The core stayed. Outside, the city rolled forward. The curbside world changed in ways small and large. Payphones vanished. Cameras appeared on stoops. Phones became trackers and recorders. Wagers drifted online. Bars brightened, menus got clean fonts, and rooms once known for card nights became brunch spots. The underworld adapted as it always had, by moving pressure around, but the space for doing things unseen shrank. Investigators kept pace. They learned to pull text messages, extract location data, and compare digital trails to the same old rhythms of Tuesday and Thursday pickups. When he returned, he kept a narrow band of activity: family, health, a few old friends. He complied with supervision and avoided scenes. Neighbors who remembered a last name would sometimes wave or ask about someone they knew long ago. He answered politely and moved along. He never tried to reassemble an old crew. Age and a changed landscape had closed that door. He didn't push on it. People ask what exactly he did to earn the title others used for him. The answer is work that looks almost ordinary until you add up how long it ran and how many people it touched. He supervised gambling books, setting lanes for collectors, balancing risk, and making sure runners did not miss dates. He approved and enforced collections on illegal loans. He oversaw payments that businesses made to avoid disruption. He helped move proceeds in ways designed to pass as legitimate revenue. None of that happened in a day. It happened across years. That repetition is what made the law call it racketeering. His demeanor never changed much across all of that. People who dealt with him describe a calm tone. Agents who tailed him say the same. He listened before he spoke, a habit that fit a job where small misreads had big costs. He used few words. He expected the same from others. He liked results more than explanations. That approach served him in two opposite ways. It made operations smooth, and it made those same operations traceable once investigators learned the rhythm. Family remained the strongest current in his life. Siblings, children, grandchildren, he kept those ties tight. Gatherings filled kitchens and living rooms, not banquet halls. Stories about the old neighborhood focused on details that belonged to anyone who grew up in Queens. Ball games in the street, summer nights when a hydrant turned the block into a river, first jobs that paid in cash and taught punctuality. If someone pushed for the other story, he stayed factual. He did not tease drama or inflate moments. He said what the court record already held. He made money in ways the law prohibits. He faced charges, he served time, and he came home to live quietly. There is a tendency to pretend that everything in that world comes down to one grand scheme. The truth is routine. Machines placed in bars produce a slow stream. Bookmakers earn week by week. Loans get collected on a schedule. Business payments arrive on fixed days. Someone sees to the calendar and the routes. He was that someone, according to agents and the cases that prevailed. The organization survived on that labor. The law eventually proved it by showing the routine to a jury, one piece at a time. He understood, perhaps better than anyone, how the same strengths could be a weakness. Routine makes a crew efficient. It also gives investigators a map. If collectors visit the same locations in the same order, surveillance teams know where to set up. If coded phrases never change, tapes get easier to translate. If shell companies invoice in a pattern, accountants can predict the next entry and test where the funds will land. He had built a machine that ran smoothly. It was smooth enough for others to chart. After years away, he found it easy to be content with modest days. A bench in the park, a paper folded under his arm, a walk that ended with a greeting from a shopkeeper who had known him since the old days. He never traded on the name for favors. He understood that the name drew as much suspicion as it did courtesy. He preferred to be an older man minding his own business, which is what, in the end, he became. Looking back, the timeline is straightforward. He grew up on hard blocks that prized family, resolve, and results. He entered a world where small assignments turned into steady responsibility. He rose to a seat where people brought him numbers and asked for decisions. Prosecutors later showed that those decisions kept illegal gambling, loans, and business payments running for years, and that the proceeds were disguised through ordinary-looking transactions. A jury agreed. He served a sentence. He returned and chose quiet. If there is a lesson, it is practical rather than moralizing. Routine is powerful. It builds systems that survive chaos. It also makes those systems vulnerable to anyone patient enough to observe them. He lived by routine. He was undone by it. That is not a contradiction. It is the simple math of a life spent balancing schedules and trusting that repetition would never be noticed by anyone who mattered. New names filled headlines in later years, but the playbook stayed recognizable. Prosecutors refined it with newer tools, and defense lawyers adjusted their lines of attack. The city kept changing faces. The streets kept echoing with the same sounds. Delivery trucks, laughter from a doorway, a cab honking at a light. He kept walking those streets without trying to turn back the clock. He had made his run. The rest belonged to other people. He never denied what the record said. He also never performed contrition for a camera. He treated the past like a set of facts, not a costume. That steadiness helped him maintain relationships that outlast headlines. It let him be present at family milestones without turning them into commentary about the old life. He stayed in the background, which is where he had always preferred to be. The work he once supervised operated in the margins, because margins are where friction is low. Retirement from that world meant returning to the same margins with different aims. He did not write a book or sit for a long interview. He left the narrative to filings and transcripts, which are dry and yet, in their way, exact. They speak to a man who helped guide revenue in a criminal enterprise, who preferred order to drama, who kept his voice level while others raised theirs, and who accepted the result when the state assembled enough proof to move him from the street to a cell and back again. They do not glamorize, they do not sermonize, they add up hours and weeks until a pattern emerges. In the late light of his story, the city looks the same as it did in the beginning and entirely different. Old clubs are gone. New storefronts glitter. Some families have left. New families have arrived. The avenues still smell like roasted nuts in winter and spilled beer in summer. Change made space for his quiet. He took it. He found satisfaction in small rituals that needed no approval. A walk, a coffee, a call to a grandchild, a visit with an old friend who remembered him not for a job title, but for the way he always kept his word about what time he would arrive. All of it leads to a plain truth. His life, as seen through the lens of public records, is not a myth. It is a chain of practical choices made inside a structure that ran parallel to legitimate commerce and fed off it. He helped run that structure, particularly in Queens and nearby towns, by coordinating gambling, loan collections, business payments, and the laundering that made proceeds look clean. The government proved it. He paid the penalty. He came home and chose stillness. He reached a stage where mornings felt like gifts and not checkpoints. He woke without alarms, opened a blind to let sun find the table, and tuned the radio low. A neighbor's dog barked. A bus hissed at the corner. The world came to him, in small notes. He liked that. In another time, he had been the one who set tempos for other people's days, who called at a certain hour, who greenlit a pickup, who said to move a machine or soften a schedule. Now he set tempos for himself. A walk to the bakery, a call to a grandson, a visit to a friend who had known him since stickball. He treated each day as a list he could finish. People often mixed up names around him. The middle initial stood for Vincent, which made strangers ask if he was someone else entirely. He wasn't. He was Richard Vincent, a brother among brothers who had taken different routes through the same neighborhoods. His place in public memory came not from speeches or flashes of notoriety, but from filings that used precise words. In those pages he appeared as a made member who rose to captain in the Gambino family, a man who supervised revenue streams that the law forbids. It is a dry description, but it fits better than legend. The work that brought him to court was the work he had done for years without fanfare. Illegal gambling is an old racket in New York. It lives wherever fans talk about games and bettors chase a chance. Bookmakers collect wagers, runners move slips in cash, and a central tally keeps risk from tipping. He understood that better than most. People who once worked under him said he kept a close eye on exposure and collections. If a weekend went bad, he didn't panic. He adjusted lines, spread risk, and cut credit. Good weeks could hide a mistake. He didn't let them. He liked steadiness over spikes. Loan collection ran on a harsher schedule. A debtor who paid on Friday had to pay on Friday next week too. Missed payments grew balances quickly. The only way to keep revenue reliable was to keep debtors on their feet. He was known to give a little room a few days here, a slight rate change there, just enough to prevent collapse. That math had no romance in it. It extended a payer's life as a payer. Prosecutors later called it predatory. Debtors who spoke in court called it pressure they couldn't dodge. Both descriptions could be true at once. Payments from businesses sat in another lane. A bar, cafe, or club might have listed the money as service on a ledger. What it bought was simple: stability. In return for the fee, nights passed without broken glass, deliveries stayed on time, and strangers didn't wander behind the counter. Owners understood that keeping the peace sometimes meant paying for it. When the government mapped those arrangements, it used a clear label: extortion. The law focuses on the coercion behind the check, not the polite wording on the invoice. Juries nodded along because the pattern made sense once they saw it laid out. None of those streams meant much without a way to move the money. Laundering gave cash a story it could tell a bank. Companies with plain names sent invoices for vague services. Checks moved through accounts in measured amounts. Cash visited a check casher, then found its way back into the system as payroll or vendor payments. The method depended on avoiding bright lights, no swelling balances, no neat patterns, no client list that looked like a family tree. Agents and accountants countered with patience. They matched deposits to dates when collections were seen, flagged a run of round figures, and followed transfers that circled back on themselves. When they drew it on a board for jurors, the path looked simple. It only looked that way because it had been walked for years. The rise that put him in charge of a crew didn't happen in a burst. It happened in small promotions that rewarded reliability. Early on, he handled parts of Queens where the family had deep roots. The Bergen Club in Ozone Park, the Ravenite down in Little Italy, those rooms drew attention for other reasons. His work drew attention only when agents decided to look for the hands that kept the machine running. They found him because he was always where he said he would be, because collectors kept the same routes, and because quiet can be as revealing as noise when someone has time to watch. The family structure shifted many times in his adult years. Carlo Gambino prized order. Paul Castellano tried to modernize and paid a price. John's grab for the top seat turned the family into a spectacle. Cameras camped on sidewalks. Reporters memorized faces. When John fell to a racketeering case in 1992, the structure needed caretakers who could keep the money steady without drawing crowds. Acting bosses took turns. Other brothers stepped forward. Richard's lane stayed the same: revenue, schedule, adjustment. He guided a crew, approved collections, and kept numbers moving up the chain. By the late 1990 seconds, the old shelters had thinned. Payphones became relics. Prepaid cells worked for a while. Then call records undercut that comfort. Title III wiretaps improved. Surveillance cameras multiplied. Some of the work migrated to new spaces, offshore betting sites, message boards, encrypted apps, but at street level, the routine still mattered. Machines still hummed in corners. Envelopes still traveled. People still preferred to talk in person when a decision could not live on a tape. He preferred that too, with walks around a block that he had walked since he was young. The case that took him off the street pulled years of small acts into one narrative. Federal prosecutors in the Eastern District assembled witnesses who had worked the routes, surveillance logs that matched phone calls to meetings, bank records that carried the shape of a laundering loop, and translations of coded phrases that had sounded harmless before. The counts covered illegal gambling, extortion, loan sharking, and money laundering. The indictment named him as a captain, placed his son among co-defendants on certain counts, and described a hierarchy that placed responsibility for parts of Queens in his hands. Defense counsel fought each thread, questioning the memory of cooperators, pressing on ambiguous phrases, and reminding jurors that the law must prove more than association. The jury returned racketeering convictions tied to those core activities. The sentence came with the weight assigned to a supervisor. Years followed, along with an order to forfeit proceeds linked to the crimes proven. He entered federal custody and did what he had always done, kept his world orderly. He read. He walked laps. He wrote letters. He kept his calls short and scheduled. He saw family inside visiting hours. Appeals argued over interpretation and process. They did not reverse the core result. He counted time as he had counted routes, one piece, then the next, until a page turned. Outside, his surname continued to draw attention it had never asked for. John died in 2002, and headlines revisited the old years. Peter's cases ran their course. Jean's narcotics conviction served as a reminder that the family's public denials about drugs had not always matched reality. Younger relatives built lives in a city that never forgets a name, even when it forgives a face. Richard was not interested in revisiting any of that. He kept his focus on the narrow present. His return did not announce itself. There was no dramatic reunion and no quiet parade. He stepped back into a life that did not need an audience. Supervised release brought rules. He met them. Meetings happened on schedule. Travel needed approval. He stayed close to home. He avoided rooms where stories gather and microphones appear under napkins. He accepted that the clock ran differently now. He set it to family events, doctor visits, and the kind of errands that make a week feel complete. The harm done by the life he had lived was not lost on him. He did not pretend that the arrangements he managed were victimless. A bettor who never dug out from a rate 8 years he could not replace. A shop owner who paid a fee for peace saw margins shrink and choices narrow. The calm that money bought for a storefront took something from the person behind the counter. He had spent decades treating those outcomes as math. Later, he let them stand as facts. He made choices. The law named them crimes. People felt the weight. He sat with that. If you strip the story down to dates, it looks clean. He was born into a crowded apartment where work meant survival. He came of age on blocks that taught loyalty and discretion. He learned the mechanics of an economy that ran parallel to the legal one. He rose from small tasks to middle supervision, then to a seat where collectors reported and bookmakers filed numbers. He was indicted on racketeering counts. He was convicted. He served a sentence. He returned to a modest life. That arc is plain. What gives it shape are the habits that carried him through each phase. Punctuality, short speech, a bias for calm solutions, and trust in routine. Law enforcement professionals who worked his cases have said, years later, that he was predictable without being careless. That distinction may sound thin. It isn't. Careless men fall quickly. Predictable men last because they avoid tantrums, but they also leave tracks. Investigators built their cases around those tracks. A collector who hits 5 locations in the same order every Tuesday and Thursday is a human metronome. A coded phrase that never changes is a glossary, not a shield. A shell company that invoices the same clients in the same amounts is a graph waiting to be drawn. He had engineered an efficient system. Efficiency has a sound. In the last stretch of his public story, the city around him went on learning new languages. Online betting went from shadow to regulation in some states. Payment apps turned pockets into wallets. Doorbell cameras recorded more of a block than anyone expected. Young men who tried to rebuild old rackets found themselves captured by devices they thought muted. Richard watched that world with a veteran's detachment. He knew the tools and the rules had shifted in ways that removed the wiggle room his generation had used. He never turned that knowledge into lectures. He let time teach. He spoke most freely about subjects that belonged to everyone. He could name a dozen corner stores that used to sit within a 10-minute walk and tell you which one sold the best olives, which one kept the coldest soda, which one would let a kid carry a tab for a week. He remembered the smell of tomato sauce on a Sunday and the feel of a stickball bat taped at the handle. He liked to talk about ball players and the way the city sounded on a summer night. Those stories felt safe because they were not about power or loss. They were about belonging to a place. When relatives asked for direct advice, he kept it simple. Keep your promises. Show up on time. Don't confuse attention with respect. Remember that money earned by pressing someone else will always come with a string in the end. He offered those lines without framing himself as a guide. He had earned a reputation for steadiness. He had also lived long enough to see the cost of it. People listened because he didn't push. If you wanted to study the case that took him down as a template, you would find a few constant lessons. Patience beats drama. Patterns convict. Financial records tell on you, even when your words don't. And in a city that never stops moving, the safest place is often the ordinary place until someone decides to follow you into it week after week. Prosecutors didn't win by revealing a secret meeting in a basement. They won by showing that 1,000 small acts formed a single picture. That is how racketeering cases work. That is how his worked. He understood that memory is a kind of neighborhood too. Some doors are closed for good. Some open only when you forget to guard them. He let his mind wander to the safe blocks. If the harder blocks appeared, he acknowledged them and moved on. He didn't rewrite. He didn't rehearse regret for public effect. He respected the fact that he had lived a life that touched many people. Some for the better in small ways. Some for the worse, in ways they would always remember. He did not seek absolution. He sought quiet. Quiet came in moments. A late afternoon with light on a table. The scent of rain on a warm sidewalk. A phone call from a grandchild who wanted help with homework. A short walk past a storefront that used to be a club, and then a pharmacy, and now a cafe. He liked noticing what stayed constant beneath changes, how blocks still belonged to kids after school, how old men still stood by barbershops talking with hands, how a good bakery could make a neighborhood feel like home. From time to time, a reporter would try again. Could he talk about his brother? Could he confirm a detail from a long-ago wiretap? He always declined. He didn't owe the past a roadmap, and didn't owe the present an anecdote. If someone wanted a version of his story, they could read filings. They were not perfect, but they were sober. They named the conduct. They explained the tools. They recorded the outcomes. They were enough. There are people who see his story as a cautionary tale, and people who see it as the story of a man who mastered a system. It can be both. He mastered the system he chose. The system, in the long run, beat him, the way it beats almost everyone who stays too long. That is not fate. It is friction between routine and attention. He thrived on routine until attention arrived and turned the same habits into evidence. He accepted that. He lived with it. In quiet evenings, he sometimes looked through old photos. Family gatherings, neighborhood corners, a vacation at a beach, crowded with umbrellas. The past did not feel like a movie. It felt like a rush of small decisions that had made perfect sense when they were made. That is the truth about most lives, even the ones that end up in court records. They are built one choice at a time, until a person can no longer pretend that the choices are isolated. He had reached that point long ago. He did not argue with it now. He came to value something that had not mattered to him in his busiest years. A day without consequences. Not a day without work or a day without errands, but a day in which nothing he did would ripple into someone else's ledger. He kept his own accounts simple. He paid bills. He sent gifts to new babies. He helped with a rent check when it mattered, and kept his help quiet. He liked to be useful in ways that did not require anyone to look over a shoulder after thanking him. What, finally, is the record that defines him? It is a listing of acts that the law has labeled clearly. He supervised illegal gambling across years that brought steady income. He approved and enforced illegal loans that rolled week by week. He oversaw the extraction of payments from businesses under the promise of calm. He helped move proceeds through companies and accounts that hid origin and made cash look clean. He held rank inside a criminal enterprise that assigned him authority over parts of Queens. He was charged. He was convicted. He was sentenced. He served. He returned. He chose a smaller life. Those statements do not require color to carry weight. He also exists outside of those facts in the private story of a large family from New York that knew hard work and hard choices. He was a brother, a husband, a father, a grandfather, an uncle, a neighbor. He kept appointments. He remembered birthdays. He took care of relatives in ways that never made papers. People who only knew his name might find that small. People who sat at his table found it large. Both views can be true. Public records are about conduct and consequences. Private lives are about presence and steadiness. He had both, and they did not cancel each other out. The street, in the end, is the same indifferent witness it has always been. It watched him when he was young and eager and moving fast, and it watched him when he was older and careful and moving slow. It saw envelopes, and then it saw grocery bags. It listened to code, and then it listened to small talk about grandkids and back pain and the price of tomatoes. The street does not judge. It records footprints. Others do the judging later. If you listen closely, his story resolves not with a flourish, but with a fade into ordinary days that suited him better than anyone might expect. The last notes are simple: a key in a door, a kettle on a stove, a phone that rings at the time it always rings, a chair where he sits with a book until the light falls. In that quiet, the city keeps going, loud as ever. Cars pass, people hurry. Somewhere a case opens with fresh names. Somewhere else, a child learns to ride a bike on a block where men once spoke in code at a corner table. He does not need to be in any of it to feel connected. He has already been part of more than enough. So his life takes its place in the long archive of New York stories, the ones that weave family, work, risk, and consequence into people, something that fits on both a page and a block. He was not the loudest. He was not the most famous. He was the one who made sure things happened on time, until time made sure everything stopped. There is a symmetry in that. He grew up in a house where keeping schedules helped a family survive. He ran a corner of an enterprise where schedules kept money moving. He served a sentence measured by schedules and returned to a home where a schedule, finally, could mean peace. If you want to remember him, remember the shape of that arc. A boy from Queens became a man who relied on order. He used it to move other people's money through channels that should not have existed. The state used its own order to trace those channels and close them. He accepted the result, came home, and built a small life he could manage without pressure. That is not glamorous. It is not designed to entertain. It is simply true, and, told carefully, it is enough to put a person to rest at night with a sense that the world, for all its noise, can still find a quiet ending to a long, complicated song. And so ends the story of Richard V. Gotti, a man who lived within the quiet pulse of a powerful legacy, where loyalty was sacred and silence was strength. His life wasn't defined by fame, but by the weight of family and the shadows of an empire he helped sustain. As the world outside grows still, his story fades softly into the night, just another echo in the long history of power and loyalty. Sleep peacefully, my friend. May your dreams be calm, your rest deep, and your night silent. Until next time, good night.